In Module 2, we are going to discuss the realm of assessment that is for the purpose of placement, specifically for placement of students who are in need of English language support services. And I have posted two important websites on this overview page. The first is the WIDA website, wida.us, where you can download many types of guidelines and documents for your information and support, as well as the Delaware DOE ELL Services website, where you can find resources specific to the state of Delaware. So, as I said, we are going to discuss the realm of assessment for the purposes of placement. And we need to think about what are the logical steps for placement of students into ELL service support. So the question we want to ask is, what steps must you and your school follow to assure that all students are receiving the language support they need for academic success? So there are a couple of steps that are extremely important and must not be overlooked. And in order for you to have support in executing those steps every year or whenever a new student comes into the school, I've actually posted on the website, on the Canvas site, a flow chart, and this is the visual of that. I know we can't read it very well here on this PowerPoint, but you can download it and refer to it anytime you need to know what steps to do first, and then depending on the results of those steps, what to do after that. So it's a useful flow chart, and it's actually in the ESL guidebook that's posted on the DOE website. So step one for any new student that arrives into your school is to have the family fill out a home language survey to determine what languages are spoken in the home, and if there are any other languages other than English spoken in the home. This is a key determiner in whether or not this student will then be screened for any particular needs that he has in English. So the next step would be the language proficiency screening. Once the results of that screening are determined, and it is determined that the student does need support for English language development, then the third step is communicating with the family. The family does need to know that services are available and that they have options about how to take advantage of those services. And then the fourth step, if the family does agree that the student will receive services, is to officially enroll them so that they become identified as ESL students. So these are the four main steps for new students that come into your school. Either from another district or another state or wherever they have come from. These are the processes that need to take place. If you have new students that come into your school that have already been identified, or you have a new class and you've got students that came from the previous grades and they've already been identified as ELLs, then you should be able to see their language proficiency scores in their CUME files or on an online information site such as iTracker Pro or the data service centers that several of the districts use. So step one, the home language survey. This has to be done in a certain way. So which students have a survey on file? All students. Every single student who comes into your school should have a home language survey on file. So if they do not speak any other language besides English, it will say that on the home language survey, and there won't be any further steps that will need to be taken. Who fills out the survey? The parents of the child fills out the survey, not the school secretary, Okay, the school secretary or anybody else in the school should not be making decisions about what information goes into that survey. The school staff can, of course, answer questions and guide the parents if they are not sure what the survey means, but the parents are the ones who need to supply that information. So what we will do once we finish this page is actually do a comparison of a couple of different surveys that are used around the country, including Delaware's own home language survey. So once it is determined that a student speaks other languages than English, the next step is the language proficiency screening. So the state of Delaware is actually in a state of change right now as to what assessments are being used for both screenings and the annual access tests, as many of you probably know. So here's what is available in Delaware now. For grades 1 through 12, actually for grades 1 in the fall, in the spring rather, through 12, the new screening test is actually called WIDA Screener, and I understand that there are both paper and online versions of that screening. The one that has been used for many years up until this year is the WIDA Access Placement Test, otherwise known as WAPT or the WAPT, and it comes in different grade levels, as noted here, the grade 1, and then 2 and 3, 4 and 5, 6 through 8, and 9 through 12. I believe the WIDA Screener is set up the same way. A very different test, however, is the test that is given to kindergartners and also first graders in the fall. So the kindergarten model test is a one-on-one interactive test that is given to kindergartners, and in the fall it is only the listening and speaking portion that is given. So who administers these screening assessments in your school? Ideally, it should be someone who is qualified to administer these tests, who has had training in administering this test, and ideally has had also ESL pedagogical training. We know this is not always feasible or practical, but that is the goal across the state of Delaware, so that these assessments are consistent and validly administered and interpreted. When should the test be administered? Ideally, within 10 days of receiving the home language survey from the student's family, if it indicates a language other than English, the another L1, okay, another first language. So within 10 days of that student arriving into school, there should be a screening test administered if the home language survey indicates that there are other languages spoken and used outside of school. So which grade level screener or model test should be used? This can be a little confusing, but the guidelines are pretty clearly spelled out in the DOE guidebook, and it really has to do with whether it is fall of the school year or spring of the school year, because of the articulations of the different grade levels of the screeners. So for example, in the fall, a kindergartner should only be given the listening and speaking test. We would not expect any kindergartner to do well on a reading and writing test. However, in the spring, if the student is new and arrives in the spring, then he would be administered the entire kindergarten model test. Also, first graders in the fall are given the kindergarten model test, not the grade 1 test. However, if they do arrive in the spring, they would then receive the grade 1 screener, grade 1, 2. And so this is how this works all the way up through grade 12. Several of the grades don't change tests from grade to grade, but there are certain articulations where you have to be careful which test you're giving. For example, you would not give a grade 3 student the grade 3 test in the fall. You would wait until the spring. If the student arrives new in the fall, you would give him the grade 1, 2 test instead. Okay. So this visual is actually a section of a report from an annual access test where WIDA has already computed the proficiency levels for the student. However, if you are administering a screener to a new student at the beginning of the school year, if you're doing it on paper, it's very likely that you will be computing the results of that score to arrive, the results of that test to arrive at the language proficiency levels of that student. If you're a school that is going to be using the new online screener, it's very likely that the online technology will compute that data for you. But the thing to note is that there are specific scores for each domain. You'll get a listening score, a speaking score, a reading score, and a writing score. And I point these out because these are the scores that will be the most useful for you in determining what your students can do in your classroom. Below you have what we would call a composite score, and this is often the only score that people talk about overall, because this will be the score that's used to determine whether the student is eligible for services. But you can see that there's a wide divergence in the individual scores that belies what the composite score is reporting. And so you also have an oral language score, which is the combination of both listening and speaking, and also a literacy score, which is the combination score for reading and writing. And then finally a comprehension score, which is the combination of scores for input for both reading and listening. So as you know, or will be learning throughout the rest of this course, there are proficiency levels that range from 1 to 6, 1 being a true beginner and 6 being native speaking or near native speaking proficiency. So as you can see, this student is a kind of intermediate student, more or less, although his speaking is a little on the low side for an intermediate student. So what scores determine whether a student is eligible for ESL support services? First, let me discuss the larger situation in the state of Delaware, which is basically an ongoing evolution of ELL testing guidelines. As you are maybe aware, the access test, which is administered annually, has experienced some dramatic changes. First, in the way it is delivered. Now it is delivered via computer administration, and then also the metrics of the scoring has changed dramatically because they have realigned the test to align better with the Common Core standards. So as a result, in this past year, there was a significant difference in the overall scoring results of our students, and there had to be some considerations regarding that. Specifically, a number of students had negative results in comparison to the results they had in the previous year. And that was because they needed to actually achieve higher raw scores in order to demonstrate the same proficiency level that they were in. And so the scores essentially do not relate to the scores of the previous year because the metrics were entirely different. And the state of Delaware is aware of that. And in case you're not aware, there have been support documents for teachers that are essentially an overlay of the most recent scores that have been rescaled back to the original metrics of the previous year so that you could have a more meaningful analysis of year-to-year growth of your ESL students. So if you're not aware of that, please ask your ESL coordinator for that resource. So let's now go back to the eligibility criteria. In other words, the criteria that you get not from the annual access test, but from the screeners that you administer to new coming students. As of this year, the guidelines for kindergarten, where you use the Model test. In the fall, you only administer the listening speaking test, and a student who achieves an overall composite score of less than 5.5 is eligible for ESL services. Going on, if you have a student who arrives after the fall semester or after January 1st, you would still administer the Model test, but you would administer all 4 domains: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And then the cut score, as it were, would be anything under 5.0. This same test should be administered also to first grade students entering in the fall. So you administer the kindergarten Model to fall first grade new coming students. And then from the spring of grade 1 all the way up to grade 12, you would administer the WIDA screener, and the cut score, the eligibility score would be anything less than 5.0 overall, the composite score. So the next steps after we determine that a student is eligible for language support services is communicating with the family. This is a really important thing that all teachers must do to make sure the family understands what are the options for their students to be successful. So be sure the parents understand that the services will help their children to succeed in class. Quite often families consider the ESL to be a negative label, and they shy away from it, and they need to be counseled as to how these services could actually support their children to succeed. But also know that parents can sign a waiver to opt out of services if they so choose. What they cannot do, though, is opt out of identification. So a student is still identified as eligible for services, and as such, the student must take the annual access test, whether they are in services or not. Okay, so, and of course the final step is enrolling into services. So eligible students not enrolled in services are still identified and must take the annual access test. So this was an overview, and again, I want to stress that the guidelines are continuing to evolve. I believe the website was just recently updated less than a year ago, and parts of the guidelines are already a little bit out of date and will probably be updated in the very near future. So with that in mind, you all need to check with your district and site ESL coordinators and coaches to make sure that you are following the most up-to-date guidelines, or more specifically, the guidelines that your district and site has chosen to follow. And another tip is to ask your ESL coordinator for your WIDA login credentials so that you can access all of the resources on the WIDA Consortium websites and download materials and guidelines that will be of use to you, and actually begin some more specific trainings as well. And as always, as you read through the materials and begin to explore the different components of ELL screening and identification, please don't hesitate to post any questions that you have.